So this video is going to start where the other video left off about MLA style and the Sam Student Handout. I'm going to go ahead and share the MLA style guide, the Sam Student Handout information. And we talked about a number of things from this source already. We've covered down to the start of formatting samples for works cited sources. So we're going to go over how to cite different types of sources and how you put those on your works cited, and also how you cite them parenthetically in your paper. So I have an example here of an article found on a website. When you use a web source as a source in a paper, you need to include some basic information in the works cited. This is the format for a website article that did not have a listed author, or it was authored by a corporation or organization. So in that case, you start with title of the article in quotation marks on your works cited, name of the website in italics, the originator or sponsor, publisher of the website, date the information was posted online, and the URL at the end of the source entry. Notice how this source entry is organized. See how this first line hits back at the 1-inch margin. Then all the additional lines of that particular entry are indented a 1/2 inch from the left side of the page. Now, it's key here. The easiest way to do this that I've found, and hanging indent in Microsoft Word may work a lot better for you than it does for me. I do better if I just type all the information in, and then I use the ruler function in Microsoft Word, and I click my cursor in front of the second line and then the third line, and I drag over a 1/2 inch so that everything lines up the way it should. Now let's say you're using material from this article in your paper. If you used material from this article in your paper, then you would put this parenthetical citation, which would and this would be placed at the end of the information you used from this particular article, and you would put the title of the article in quotation marks. Since it's a short title, very short title, you can use both words. If this title had begun with an article like a, an, or the, you would leave that off. And then put quotation marks around the title, and then put the page number where the information you used is located. If it had a credited author instead of just the name of the article, you would put the author's last name and the page number in the parenthetical citation. Now here's an Alabama Virtual Library article. Notice it does have an author. So now I'm going to cite material from this article to the author's last name, because that's the first identifying piece of information found in the works cited source entry. This is the works cited source entry for the AVL article. Notice it has first the author's last name, a comma, the author's first name, the name of the article, the name of the magazine or journal in which the information is located, the volume number, the issue number, if the magazine or journal has those, and most of them do, the date the information was published online, the page range for the article. This must have been a 1-page article. The name of the database used from the Alabama Virtual Library, and notice that's also formatted in italics, and then the URL for that database, and an access date. So let's say I accessed this article on the 18th of March 2020. This is the format for that. Now, if I used material from this source in my paper, I would then also list parenthetical citations with the author's last name and the page number upon which the information was found. Now, if you use something from a source, you have to do two parts. You have to list the source on the works cited, that's part one. You have to cite the work parenthetically in your paper, that's part two. And I'm going to check to see that you did both things. So I don't need to see a parenthetical citation to Geschlin in your paper and not be able to find a source by Geschlin on your works cited. I don't need to find a source from Geschlin on your works cited, but not find a single citation to Geschlin in the paper. So it's a two-part thing. You have to have both items. Often the Alabama Virtual Library provides sample source entries for articles found in its databases. Sometimes those are a good starting point. Occasionally they're perfectly correct, except you may have to fix the font, spacing, indenting. But sometimes they'll be almost correct. Maybe there'll be an extra punctuation mark thrown in or some capitalization of the title that's not quite correct. Find the example one that AVL provides that gives you MLA 9th edition format, and then check it against the MLA handbook or against this handout to make sure the format is correct before putting it in your paper. Page numbers, I've already previously mentioned, but it bears mentioning again. MLA doesn't require page numbers when you're parenthetically citing an online source. However, if the source isn't paginated or doesn't have paging, I want you to provide those page numbers so that you have practice using parenthetical citations. If no page numbers are given, act as if you're going to print the source and either print it and find the page number upon which the information appears, or print preview it and look and see what page the information you used appears on in that case. Now, there are some other examples of types of information that you can cite for different situations. They're not going to apply for papers in this course, so we're going to sort of skip over them at this point, but you do have these formats in case you should need to look back at them at any point for future use. So there's actually a format to cite a PowerPoint presentation given to you by an instructor, a class lecture you heard an instructor give, a handout provided in class. Those are also available to you in here. Now, what do you do if you have two articles on your works cited and they have the same title and there are no authors listed and no editors listed? How do you distinguish between those two articles in parenthetical citations in the body of the essay? So these are the same two sources I used earlier in the handout. Notice the two article titles are identical. So if I'm going to cite those parenthetically in my paper, it's going to be hard for the person who's reading the paper to tell if I'm talking about this article or this article. To make that work, what I need to do is give enough information that it's obvious to the reader which source I'm referring to. So here, the first thing that's different about each of these articles is the names of the websites. The first word that's different in this one is occupational, and the first word that's different in this one is Wallace. So here's what I would do for my parenthetical citations in this particular situation. I would put my two article names. They're identical. I would put brackets. Notice those are brackets. They're not parentheses. And I would put the first word that's a significant word of the website name in the brackets so that it's obvious that this is material taken from the Occupational Outlook Handbook site and this is material taken from the Wallace State My Career site. And that's how I would put those into my paper if I used information from each of those on page 1, for example. Now, I could also provide information in what we call the signal phrase, or the introductory phrase that leads up to the cited material, where I name which website I'm using. And since I've named the website there, I don't have to put it in here because it's clear. But after a while, that gets a little bit clunky, having to repeat those same things over again. So you're really better off most of the time to go this route and actually put in the parenthetical citation a little more information so that it's clear to the reader which source is which. There are some additional examples here that are useful for literature courses or situations where you have collections of short stories or collections of material within a book. And so those are available to you in this handout, because this handout is used with not just English 101, but also 102 and literature courses as well. So these examples would be more important later on in most cases for various types of literature and works of art and so forth, and for images as well. But you have those in case you should need them for anything. Now, here's an example of how do you parenthetically cite when you have two authors who have the same last name. You add enough information to tell the difference between them. And most of the time, that's going to be the first initial. So first initial, if you had, say, an Anna Smith and a Kieran Smith, you would put A for Anna, K for Kieran, and then put a period after the first initial of the first name, put the last name and the page number. If you have multiple authors, then you need to, if you have 3 or 2, you list the author's names in the parenthetical citation. So let's say you have an article authored by these 3 people, Salerno, Warren, and Morris. You put all 3 of their names and the word "and," not the ampersand symbol, but the actual word and the page number. Now, if there were only 2 of them, you would just put the last name of the first one, the last name of the second one, with an "and" between them, no commas. If you have an article with a lot of authors, 4 or more, now that doesn't often happen except for in scholarly articles where they're journal articles and people have collaborated on them. But in that case, you use the last name of the first author, and then you use the abbreviation et al., which means "and others." And you put a period after the AL, the all, and then you put the page number upon which the information is located. And then, of course, you would follow that with a period as well. So here are some examples in which authors' names appear in the essay text. So if you have an author's name showing up in the text of an essay, then in the sentence itself is what I mean by in the text of an essay, then you don't have to rename the author at the end of the sentence in the parenthetical citation. So what you do is you've named the authors in the actual sentence in the paper. Salerno, Warren, and Morris assert that poetry is relevant for today's students. Then all you have to do in parentheses is put the page number where they said that. Now notice none of that's in quotation marks, so that means I read stuff on that page and I summarized it in my own words, but I did not use their words. Here's how you would do that if you have 4 or more authors. You would use that same thing, Nix et al., Nix and others. Notice the period does go there. It's an abbreviation and it's an acceptable one to use. Note that the current trends in service learning are impressive. Page number here, but since you've already given credit to the authors in the sentence itself, you don't have to rename the authors here. That would be what we call redundant. You would be repeating for no reason. If you have 2 or more articles written by the same person, then you're going to have to provide enough information in the body of your paper when you parenthetically cite to give credit for the piece of the two different pieces of literature from which you've taken the information. So to distinguish between them, you put the author's last name, a comma, you put in the name of the article, shortened is fine and follow those shortening rules we've talked about previously, and the page numbers upon which that information is located. And then, of course, if those citations are at the end of the sentence, you'd put a period after those as well. There is a format here for citing the Bible and also one for citing indirect sources. It's always best to take material from its original source and not use secondhand source material. So if you're going to quote someone, it's best to quote from that person's original work. If you have to quote someone who's being quoted by the author of the source, there's a format for how to do that, and it's listed here. Sometimes you're going to cite multiple sources in the same citation. Let's say you're doing a paper and you read 2 articles and you got some information that was complementary from those 2 articles, and so you summarized material from both articles into a couple of sentences where you melded those ideas together. Then you would cite both authors at the end of the last sentence that you got ideas from them in. So you would put the first author's name, last name and page number, a semicolon, and the second author's last name and page number. Now, if you had done 2 sources and you only had article titles, you did the same thing. You just put the article titles and page numbers. Notice there's a semicolon between those, and that designates where one source stops and the next one begins. There are a number of different types of non-print sources that are sometimes used for various types of research, and there are specific examples for how to cite everything from tweets to movies to presentations, television programs, things that are on social media of various types. So there are methods for all of that. Those are probably not going to be sources you'll be using for a paper in this course, but if you needed a format for that, you can find it in the 9th edition of the MLA Handbook. Now, one of the things you will want to do in the course of writing papers for this course is you'll have to have some quotations here and there. A quotation occurs when you pull word for word material from a source. And most of the time you do that when you're writing about literature and you want to pull in a quotation from the piece of literature to prove a point. Then you put that material in quotation marks. My typical rule, and a lot of instructors follow the same rule, is if you pull something word for word from a source, then if you use 3 or more words in a row from that source, you put that in quotation marks and you provide a parenthetical citation. If you put something in your own words, then don't put the material in quotation marks, but do provide the parenthetical citation. Here's the difference. These 2 citations both refer to a short story. And notice this first one, early in the story, the narrator observes that the bowl was perfect. The bowl was perfect is taken word for word from the short story on page 727. So I have the author's last name and the page number where that quoted material exists. But if I read that material from the story and then I make an observation about it and I summarize, And I say, early in the story, the author establishes the significance of the bowl when the narrator observes its flawlessness. Okay, none of those words are exactly the same as the ones in the story. The narrator observes its flawlessness is my rewording of the narrator's statement that the bowl was perfect. So I still got that information on page 727. I still got it from the same source, but I put it in my own words. And now I don't have a quotation. I have what we call a paraphrase. So I still have to give credit because I learned it from that source. But I don't put the material in quotation marks. Only what's quoted word for word goes in quotation marks. And in the case of literature, we often refer to those as proof quotations, where you pull something word for word from a story or a poem or a book to prove a point. We won't be doing poetry quoting in this course, so I'm going to skip over the poems part and the drama part, but those are important for later on. If you take English 102, you will need to know that information, how to quote from those two types of literature. And again, this continues that and examples of quotations. Now, there's information on here about how to format a long quotation. You aren't writing long enough papers in this course to format a long quotation, because typically my rule is that 20% of your paper can be quoted material. So that means that if your entire paper is 5 paragraphs, that would mean if you put all the quoted material in your paper together, it could only be 1 paragraph. And so if each of your paragraphs is, say, 7 sentences, that would mean that in your entire paper, you could only have the equivalent of 7 sentences worth of quoted word for word material. So long quotations are 4 lines or more. Well, that means you've got a lot of quoted material in one place, and it's sort of quote heavy in one paragraph for a brief paper. So there's an example in here, or there are multiple examples of how to quote from something longer when you pull a longer quotation, but we are not going to use that in this course. I prefer that you not do those long quotations in this course, because they simply take up too much of your quoting space and they look a little off balance in a paper as brief as the ones you write for this class. But you do have those examples here if you needed them. And then here's a section on adding and omitting words. If you need to add a word into a quotation to clarify the meaning of the quotation, or if you need to change a letter, then here's what you do. Whatever you added to the quotation, you put brackets around it. So notice that this particular sentence begins with the last name of the author of the source. The quoted portion is in quotation marks. The page number upon which that information is found is the only thing in the citation, and the reason for that is the name of the author of the article is already in the sentence. And then the portion that I added as the writer of an essay is this, to clarify who the he, or whom the he is that the author is referring to. So that's the reason for that particular formatting. Now, if you leave something out of a quotation, let's say that you decide you're going to quote part of a sentence, but you really don't need the middle of it. You just need part of it. If you leave something out in the middle of a quotation, then you use what are called ellipses, which are 3 periods with spaces between them. And those 3 represent that material has been left out. So what this means is I started the quotation, I left out some things in the middle I didn't need to prove my point, and then I finished the quotation. Notice that the author of the source is listed in the sentence here again. So all that's in my parenthetical citation is the page number. I don't have to include the author's name again because the author of the article is listed in the sentence. One of the important things you have to do when writing a formal essay assignment is to introduce every quotation with a signal phrase. We call them signal phrases, but they can actually be phrases, clauses, or even complete sentences followed by a colon. So let's say I'm going to quote something word for word from a source. I need some kind of lead in or introduction to that quoted material. So here's an example of one way to do that. This is a complete sentence used to introduce a quotation. Mrs. Slade's high opinion of her position as Delphine's wife is apparent in the story. That's a complete sentence followed by a colon. So that particular sentence is what we call a signal phrase. It introduces a quotation from the story. Here's the quotation. She had always regarded herself with a certain conjugal pride as his equal in social gifts, as contributing her full share to the making of the exceptional couple they were. And then notice there are ellipses here because some material has been left out. This ends the quotation. Wharton is the name of the author of the story where that quotation was taken from, and the page number is 115. Notice that the period that ends the entire sentence is placed after the parenthetical citation. So there are some additional signal phrase introduction quotation examples here. In the words of scholar Tim Jameson, and then you would put a quotation from Jameson's work, Smith and Thomas offer a different opinion, colon. That's a complete sentence, so you put a colon after it and then put the quotation. Or you can put the quotation first if you have a good signal phrase to end the sentence. Or Harold Brown's research points out that, and then you put in your quotation. So what you want to make sure you don't do is you want to make sure you do not just drop a quotation in. A sentence in your essay should not begin with quotation marks, typically, unless the sentence in front of that sentence introduces the quoted material and ends with a colon. So we're going to stop here, and then we'll move on in the next video to a detailed discussion of some things to remember about writing an essay and also some things to remember about avoiding plagiarism. Thank you.